The first point that I note about these assumptions and risks is that which are assumptions and which are risks are not identified. In fact, all seem to be assumptions, and this is quite common, I find, in our projects. There seems to be a tendency to only include assumptions or to phrase events as assumptions rather than to identify risks. Perhaps it's because we should be proposing mitigation measures for risks that we tend to just phrase everything as an assumption. The first assumption, or is it a risk here, is interesting. As phrased, I would think this was a killer assumption. This is a sector development program or a policy-based type loan. We know from evaluation experience that it is absolutely essential that there be an influential champion for change to drive a successful reform program. So if this assumption is telling me that there isn't strong political will at the start of the project, then I would say that this was a killer assumption or a killer risk. If, however, it was phrased that there is a risk that strong political will may not be maintained throughout the project period, then of course this would be a very valid and an important risk that we should be monitoring, and we should be prepared to take corrective action if the event starts to happen, that is, that political will is not being maintained. The second assumption, or risk, that all necessary legislative arrangements are in place may well be internal to the project, because if this is going to see the legislation passed under the project, then we would say it was internal and shouldn't be included. But if this is other legislative arrangements that is outside the scope of this project, then it's valid to include it as an assumption or risk. The third point here is really just not capable of being monitored. How do we monitor full cooperation of all parties? What does that mean? Perhaps the fourth point describes it in a little more detail, but once again, I would ask whether this was internal to the management of the project rather than something outside our control. That the participatory approach is successful would seem to be an internal aspect of the project. That is, it's something that should be under the control of the project managers. Therefore, we wouldn't include it in the project framework. The final assumption, that capital investment funding by ADB and other co-financiers are available, at first thought was something internal, that is, it was to be provided by this project. But as I had further discussion, it turns out that this was additional financing, and therefore it is valid that it be included as an assumption. Here is a second set of assumptions and risks for you to comment on, this time from a project in Papua New Guinea. I'd offer the following comments on these assumptions and risks from the project in Papua New Guinea. First of all, and as I've said before, let's see the assumptions identified as assumptions and the risks identified as risks. The first assumption is problematic because what it seems to be telling us is that one of the monitoring mechanisms that we've proposed, that is the use of national income data and detailed human development surveys, is not available. This means that we won't be able to measure our target and indicator using the monitoring mechanism proposed. So therefore we really need to go back and redesign different targets and indicators with a different monitoring mechanism so that the data is in fact available. The second assumption or risk, generally we leave out what we might term acts of God, because these things are so unpredictable that we can't monitor their occurrence. We tend not to include them. Delays in project implementation is clearly something that is internal or within the control of project management, so we should not include it as an assumption and risk in the project framework. The unavailability and/or lack of funding for development of required complementary services. Now, if this is a key requirement or a needed requirement for success of the project, then this could well be a killer assumption or a killer risk, because in this context, it is probably highly likely that the adequate funding will not be available. So if this is in fact a killer assumption or killer risk, we may need to go back and redesign the project. And the last point, ADB no longer uses benefit monitoring and evaluation as the means for assessing and reporting on the achievement of results of projects. So we should not have mention of BME or benefit monitoring and evaluation.